Hi everyone and welcome to NeuroPresence. My name is Sonia.
And I'm Giovanna.
We're both psychology students at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and we're both very excited to host this podcast for you today.
So Sonia, tell everyone what NeuroPresence is.
At NeuroPresence, we believe that access to psychological science should be equal and available to everyone. This space was created to make evidence-based psychology more understandable and more practical to everyday life.
Like Sonia, I'm also an undergraduate student studying psychology at Macquarie University. The name NeuroPresence comes from two ideas. So neuro refers to neurons in the brain, which is the biological foundation of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviours. And presence reflects our awareness, intention, and being actively engaged with our internal experiences. So together, NeuroPresence represents the space where neuroscience meets our conscious awareness.
That's very nice. Thank you so much, Gio. So, what's the plan for this podcast? Each month, we focus on one psychological topic and explore it across 4 weekly episodes. This month, we're focusing on habits. In today's episode, we'll start with the basics. What habits are, how they form, how and why they're so powerful, and we're going to explain it from both psychological and neuroscientific perspectives. Now let's talk about habits. Before we talk about changing a habit or breaking bad ones, we first need to understand what a habit actually is. Because a lot of people think habits are just routines, things you do every day. But from a psychological perspective, habits are much more than that.
Yeah, so what would you say is the actual core definition of what a habit is?
That's a very good question. So, in psychology, a habit is defined as a learned behavior that becomes automatic through repetition. That means it's a behavior you've done so many times in a similar context that your brain starts doing it with a very little conscious. You don't actively decide to do it anymore. Your body just do it. So habits are not just about motivations. They are about automation. Think about brushing your teeth. You don't wake up every single day and think about it and decide should I do it or not. Your body already knows what to do. That's what makes something a habit. Not how often you do it, but how automatically it happens.
So how would you then specify what a habit is compared to a goal and compared to a routine?
This is really important actually. Habits are not same as goals. A goal is something that you aim. A habit is something you repeatedly do. And habits are also different from routines. A routine still requires conscious effort, but habit, it runs in the background. In other words, habits are behaviors that have been handed over from conscious control to automatic control.
So why does the brain just love habits so much?
The reason habits exist is actually very simple. Your brain is designed to save energy. Thinking, deciding, and self-control requires a lot of cognitive resources. So when the brain notices that a certain behavior keeps happening in the same context, it tries to automate it. Habits are the brain's way to being efficient to save energy.
So are you saying that habits can be just good, just bad, or can they be both a mixture of good and bad?
Honestly, the brain doesn't care about it. It's the important part. A habit can be good or bad, but what matters is that how often it's repeated. That's why both healthy behaviors and unhealthy behaviors can turn into habits.
Wow.
If I want to summarize what I just said about habits, I'd say a habit is a learned behavior that becomes automatic through repetition. It's triggered by context and requires very little conscious and awareness.
So now that we understand what a habit actually is, the next question is how do habits actually form? And so that's where the habit loop comes in. And I'm going to explain that next.
Now let's move to habit loop. Gio, can you please explain to us what it actually is?
Yeah, for sure. So to really understand habits, we need to look at what psychologists call the habit loop, which is a 3-part cycle that explains how behaviors become automatic over time. At its core, the habit loop is made up of a cue, a routine, and a reward. But underneath that very simple structure is an extremely powerful neural system designed to conserve mental energy and maximize efficiency, because that's the goal at the end of the day. The brain's main goal is to maximize all of the pleasure and minimize all of the effort that it takes to do a task.
So, you mentioned that there is a cue. Can you explain to us what
Yeah,
it is?
definitely. So a cue is any trigger that tells your brain now is the time to act. It could be a time of day, it could be an emotional state, and it could even be the people that you're around at that specific time. Neuroscientifically, though, a cue activates areas in the sensory cortex and the amygdala, which helps to detect relevance and emotional significance. Once a cue is recognized, it signals to the basal ganglia, which is the brain's habit center, to prepare a behavioral sequence that's been stored from past experiences. Next comes the routine, and that's the behavior itself. That can be physical, like reaching out for your phone, or it could be mental, like slipping into a negative self-talk or a bad mental state. And here's where the brain gets efficient. With repetition, control of the behavior shifts from the prefrontal cortex, which handles conscious decision-making, to the basal ganglia, which specifies in automation. So in other words, what starts as a deliberate conscious choice becomes automatic over a step-by-step process over time. It takes time to form a habit. It doesn't just happen straight away. This happens over a specific amount of time. So that's when we reach the reward, and that's when the learning is actually locked in. So rewards activate the brain's dopamine system, particularly pathways involving the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. And dopamine doesn't just make us feel good, although a lot of people think, oh, dopamine's just the happy chemical, which it is the happy chemical, makes you happy, but there's also a lot of other reasons that dopamine exists and is released within the brain and the body. And in this context, in terms of habits and habit loops, dopamine teaches the brain that the sequence is worth repeating. So dopamine is the chemical that tells the brain, yes, I choose this sequence to repeat over and over again. It creates the habit, it makes the habit worth repeating. So over time, the brain starts releasing dopamine before the reward actually happens. At the moment of the cue, the anticipation strengthens the loop and makes the habit feel almost inevitable. So when you put it all together, a habit loop becomes a reinforcing circuit. A cue triggers a routine, and the routine leads to a reward. And the reward strengthens the neural pathway that links them all together. This process is driven by something called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is just a fancy scientific way, it's just a word that psychologists use to explain the brain's ability to rewire itself based on experience. The more a loop is repeated in your brain, the more those neural connections are reinforced and strengthened through something called long-term potentiation. Mm-hmm. So that makes the behavior faster, easier, and more automatic over a certain period of time. And this explains something really, really important. Habits don't disappear, they're just overwritten by other habits. So the neural pathway for an old habit very rarely would get deleted. What happens instead is new routines have to be built on top of the same cue and reward structure. And that's why lasting change isn't about willpower alone, it's actually about redesigning the loop.
That's very nice. Now, when we talk about habits, we're not just talking about behaviors. We're talking about specific patterns of brain activity that gradually shifts from conscious control to automatic execution.
And branching off what we were talking about earlier, at the center of this process is a network of brain regions that work together to turn repeated actions into stable neural circuits.
That's very nice. One of the most important structures in this network is basal ganglia. This deep brain system plays a critical role in action selection, motor patterns, and behavioral automation. As a habit forms, activity in the basal ganglia increases, while the activity in the prefrontal cortex it decreases. And what is prefrontal cortex? I have to say is the area responsible for planning and self-control. So, Gio, can you explain more to us?
Yeah, for sure. So in simple terms, the brain is outsourcing the behavior from conscious effort to automatic processing. And that shift is made possible via neuroplasticity. And that's what we were talking about before. It's the brain's ability to reorganize itself in response to a repeated experience. So every time a behavior is repeated, the neurons involved in that action fire together. Because as we always say, neurons that fire together, wire together, through a process called long-term potentiation. And that's the synaptic connections between those neurons when they strengthen, and that makes the behavior faster and it makes it more reliable for the next time that the behavior actually occurs.
Exactly. Dopamine also plays a central role, as we mentioned before, not just as a good feel chemical, but as a learning signal. When a behavior leads to a positive outcome, dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area release bursts of activity that travels to striatum and prefrontal cortex. This tells the brain the sequence matters. Remember it.
And over time, dopamine begins to fire in response to the prediction of the reward, not just the reward itself. And that strengthens the anticipation and reinforces the repetition. And there's also a huge emotional layer to that as well. It's very complex. So the amygdala attaches emotional meaning to habits, especially those that are linked to stress, comfort, or safety. This is why habits formed during emotionally intense moments, like stress eating or nail biting, can feel particularly hard to break. They're not just behavioral patterns, they're emotionally encoded neural responses. Meanwhile, the hippocampus stores contextual information, where you were, who you were with, and what was happening when that habit actually formed. That's why certain places or situations can suddenly trigger behaviors that you thought that you've already outgrown. The brain isn't being irrational, it's being associative.
Exactly. So together these systems form what the neuroscientists call a habit circuitry network, linking cognition, emotion, motivation, and motor control into a single streamlined process. And the more this connection is used, the more efficient it becomes. The brain is essentially saying, why think about it when I can run it automatically?
And here's the hopeful part about that, because the brain is very changeable. That's what neuroplasticity is. It means that the brain isn't fixed. The brain can always change, it can always remold itself, it can always learn new things. Psychologists used to think that your brain was fixed and that you couldn't develop new neural connections beyond a certain age. Now we know that's not true. You can actually change your brain no matter what age you are. And that also means that your habits are not fixed. The same neural mechanisms that build habits can also rebuild them. With repeated intentional practice, new pathways can be strengthened and old ones can lose their dominance.
So change is a matter of erasing the brain's wiring. It's about rewiring it.
Exactly.
Now let's move to the next part. Let's talk about good habits. Now that we understand what habits are and how they work in the brain, the next question is, how do good habits actually form? Because most people assume good habits requires so much strong motivation or discipline, but psychology tells us that motivation is not the main driver of habit formation. Actually, from a psychological perspective, good habits are built through repetition in a stable context. The brain doesn't wait for you to feel motivated. It learns through doing the same behavior again and again in the same situation. So consistency matters far more than intensity. Also, environment plays a significant role in this part. You can explain to us what environment does?
Yeah, absolutely. So your environment is actually one of the strongest predictors of a good habit formation. Our behavior is heavily influenced by what's around us, what we see, what's available, and what's easy just at hand for us in that moment of time. So when a behavior is easy to start and hard to avoid, your brain is more likely to repeat that behavior.
That's very interesting. So, for example, let's say I want to drink water more to keep hydrated, but I keep drinking coffee instead, or keep drinking soft drinks instead. What should I do?
Well, it's actually very simple because you have to start small with things like that. You're changing your environment is a lot more effective than just relying on your willpower alone to drink water. So think about it like this. If you want to drink more water, but every time you open the fridge, the first thing that you see is soft drink, what do you think your brain's going to grab? It's going to grab the soft drink. It's there, it's in your environment, it's easy for you to grab. It's right at your eye level. So what you should do instead is just put some cold water just at your eye level. So the second you open your fridge, that's what you see. You see the cold water. You see the thing that you want to grab. You see the behavior that you want to change, and that behavior actually changes. You put the soft drink, maybe have a few cans of soft drink just so you know your brain knows that you do have that variety, but put it right at the back. Put the cold drink at your eye level. And that's going to change the way that you psychologically perceive the drinks in your fridge. You're going to grab the water first.
You can make it more simple.
Yeah, exactly. So what you've done there, you haven't changed your motivation. You haven't changed your willpower. What you did instead is you've just changed your environment. And that can go for so many other things as well. Not just water, not just soft drinks. There are so many different array of things that goes for. to just changing your environment. It's simple, it's easy, and it works.
I see. So I think you're saying that small actions actually are more important than big differences that we're going to
Yeah,
make.
absolutely. A lot of people think that they need to make huge, big changes to change their habits and change their motivation. That's not the case. Small actions actually create real change. Good habits don't need to be big. In fact, small behaviors are actually more likely to stick. When a habit feels achievable, like for example, having the water right there in front of you, your brain experiences less resistance and more reward. Over time, those small actions build very strong neural pathways.
So I think a reward is very important in this part as well. Good habits are also reinforced by reward, not necessarily pleasure, but a sense of completion or progress. When the brain detects a positive outcome, dopamine is the hormone that helps the change in a behavior. This makes the habits more likely to happen again and again.
Yeah, definitely.
So if I want to summarize, good habits form when behaviors are repeated consistently, supported by the environment and reinforced by the brain. They don't require perfection, they require persistence. And this becomes especially important when we start talking about bad habits. And in the next part, we're going to talk about more neuroscientifically about these habits. So everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. In our next episode, we'll be focusing on bad habits, why they're so difficult to break, and what psychology and neuroscience tell us about real lasting change. If you found today's episode helpful, make sure to follow NeuroPresence so you don't miss the rest of the series. And if you think this conversation could help someone else, feel free to share it.
Thank you all so much for being here, and we're so excited to see you in our next episode.